On the 1st of June, in the year 1310, a woman was led to a wooden platform in the Place de Grève in Paris. She was somewhere in her 50s or 60s, though no one had recorded the year of her birth. Her name was Marguerite Porete, and she had been silent for 18 months. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone who has said everything and will not unsay it. The inquisitors had asked her to recant. She had not answered. They had asked her again. She had not answered. They had brought theologians to her cell, and priests and men who understood the consequences of her silence better than she possibly could, and still she had not answered. She had looked at them, or perhaps through them, and she had said nothing at all. The fire was built carefully. They were good at this by 1310. They knew how to stack the wood, how to account for wind, how to make it burn evenly, and they knew to throw the book in with her. Not just any book, but her book. The one she had spent years writing, the one that had already been burned once before in the public square of Valenciennes, the one she'd been warned never to circulate again. She had circulated it anyway. She had given it to bishops. She had given it to a papal legate. She had sent it across borders and into the hands of people who could read Latin, and people who could only read French, and people who, she believed, were waiting for exactly the words she had written. The book was called The Mirror of Simple Souls. It was about love. It was about the annihilation of the self in the presence of God. It was about a soul so completely surrendered to divine love that it no longer needed anything else. Not the sacraments, not the intercession of priests, not the church itself. And that last part, the part about the church, was why they burned her. But here is what the men who built that fire did not know, and could not have known, and would not have believed if someone had told them. The book they threw into the flames was already loose in the world, already copied, already travelling by routes they could not trace. Within a century it would be translated into Latin, into Italian, into Middle English. It would be read in monasteries and in private homes, and in the cells of other mystics who recognised in its pages something they had felt but could not name. It would survive for 600 years, passed from hand to hand, discussed and debated and treasured, and for most of that time, no one would know that a woman had written it. The manuscripts that survived carried other names, male names, safe names, names that did not carry the stain of heresy. The words were hers. The credit went to others. It was not until the 20th century, when scholars began to compare texts and examine the historical record, that Marguerite Porete's name was attached again to the work she had died for. The book that was supposed to turn to ash outlived not only its author, but the entire inquisitorial system that condemned her. And yet the woman herself remains a kind of ghost. We know almost nothing about her life before the trial. We do not know what she looked like, or where exactly she was born, or what her voice sounded like when she spoke the words she later wrote down. What we have is the book. What we have is the transcript of her condemnation. What we have is the strange, luminous, terrifying text that she refused to disown, even when disowning it would have saved her life. What does it mean to write something so true to yourself that you would rather burn than pretend you did not mean it? What does it mean to fall silent not because you have been defeated, but because you have already said the only thing that matters? And what does it mean that the word survived anyway? That the fire took the woman and the parchment and left the ideas to wander the world without her? These are the questions at the heart of this story. And to understand any of them, we have to go back, slowly, carefully, to a world that looks nothing like our own. A world where the church was not merely a spiritual authority, but a political one, where theology was not an academic exercise, but a matter of life and death, where a woman who claimed to understand God without the help of priests was not simply wrong, but dangerous. We have to go back to the 13th century, to the Low Countries, to a movement of women who wanted to live holy lives but did not want to become nuns, and to the particular woman among them who decided that what she had learned about divine love was too important to keep to herself. So, settle in. This is a long story, and it moves through shadows. We're going to follow Marguerite Porete from the world that made her to the fire that took her to the centuries of strange survival that came after. We have all the time in the world. In the late 12th and early 13th centuries, something was happening to women in the cities of what is now Belgium, the Netherlands and northern France. Something the church had not anticipated and did not entirely know how to handle. Women were choosing in growing numbers to live religious lives outside the convent walls. They were not becoming nuns. They were not taking permanent vows. They were not placing themselves under the authority of a mother superior or accepting the enclosure that cloistered life required. Instead, they were gathering in small communities or living alone, praying and working and caring for the sick and the poor, wearing simple clothes that marked them as dedicated to God but not as members of any recognised order. They called themselves Beguines. The name itself is mysterious. No one is entirely sure where it came from. Some scholars have traced it to a priest named Lambert le Bègue, who may have encouraged the movement in its early years. Others have suggested it derives from an old word for begging, or for the colour beige, or for some long-forgotten term that slipped out of use before anyone thought to write down its meaning. What matters is that the Beguines were new, and they were numerous, and they were difficult to categorise. Imagine a city in the year 1220, Liège perhaps, or Ghent, or Bruges. The streets are narrow and uneven, pressed between stone buildings that lean toward each other as if sharing secrets. The air smells of wood smoke and river water, and the particular mustiness of wool that has never quite dried. And walking through those streets you might see a woman in a plain grey or brown dress, her hair covered, her bearing quiet and purposeful. She's not a nun, though she might be mistaken for one at a distance. She's not a laywoman in the ordinary sense, though she owns no cloister and answers to no abbess. She's something in between. The Beguines lived in that in-between space. Some of them gathered in communities called beguinages, small neighbourhoods of houses arranged around a courtyard or a chapel, where women could live together in mutual support while maintaining individual households. Others lived alone, in rented rooms or small houses, pursuing their devotions in solitude. They supported themselves through manual labour, weaving, spinning, caring for the sick, teaching children. They took no permanent vows, which meant they could leave if they chose to, could marry if they wished, could return to ordinary life without the scandal of a broken religious commitment. And yet they lived as if they had taken vows, in poverty and chastity and prayer. The church did not know what to make of them. On one hand, the Beguines were clearly pious. They cared for lepers when others would not. They prayed with a fervour that put many ordained priests to shame. They lived simply and served others and seemed, by every outward measure, to be doing exactly what Christ had asked. On the other hand, they were outside the system. They were not under the supervision of any recognised religious order. They were not bound by the rule of St. Benedict or St. Augustine, or any other established framework. They were women, acting on their own spiritual authority, making their own decisions about how to live and pray and serve. That autonomy made the church nervous. It made certain bishops very nervous indeed. Because the Beguines were not simply living pious lives in quiet corners. Some of them were writing, some of them were teaching, some of them were developing sophisticated theological ideas about the nature of the soul and its relationship to God. Ideas that did not always align with what the church taught. Ideas that sometimes seemed to suggest that a person could reach God directly, without the mediation of priests or sacraments. And that was the fear that would eventually consume Marguerite Porete. Not that she was living outside the convent. Many women did that without incident. Not that she was a Beguine. The movement had its defenders as well as its critics, but that she had written something down, that she had dared to describe in her own words what she believed the soul could become, and that what she described looked to certain readers like a threat to everything the church was built upon. We do not know when Marguerite Porete was born, or where. The historical record is silent on her origins, her family, her education. What we can say with some confidence is that she came from the region of Hainaut, in what is now the border area between France and Belgium, and that she was literate, not merely able to read but able to write with sophistication and power. This was not common for women in the 13th century. It was not common for most people. The ability to read and write was a privilege, and the ability to write well, to construct arguments, to play with language, to build a sustained work of theological reflection, required training and practice, and access to books and teachers. Marguerite had all of that somehow. We do not know how. Perhaps she came from a wealthy family with the resources to educate a daughter. Perhaps she received her training in a beguinage, some of which offered instruction in reading and writing. Perhaps she found teachers among the clergy, or among other Beguines who had learned before her. What we know is the result. The Mirror of Simple Souls, a book of roughly 60,000 words in its complete form, written in Old French, structured as a dialogue between characters named Love, Reason, and the Soul. The book is strange. It is also beautiful. and it is in places genuinely radical. Radical enough that you can read it today, 700 years later, and feel a small shock at what this medieval woman was willing to say. The core of Marguerite's teaching is the idea of annihilation, not physical annihilation. She was not talking about death, or at least not primarily about death. She was talking about the annihilation of the self, the will, the individual ego. She believed that a soul could become so perfectly united with God through love that it no longer had any will of its own, no longer desired anything for itself, no longer even thought of itself as a separate being. The soul, in this state, became nothing, and in becoming nothing, it became everything. It became God, in a certain sense, because it no longer existed as a distinct entity that could be separated from God. This sounds mystical, and it is. But Marguerite pushed the implications further than most mystics were willing to go. She argued that a soul in this state of annihilation no longer needed the Church. Not because the Church was bad, but because the Church was a structure designed for souls that were still struggling, still learning, still climbing the ladder toward God. A soul that had reached the top of the ladder did not need the ladder anymore. It did not need the sacraments, because the sacraments were means to an end, and the end had been achieved. It did not need confession, because there was no longer a separate self to confess. It did not even need the virtues, faith, hope, charity, because these two were for souls still in motion, still reaching, still incomplete. The soul annihilated in love, Marguerite wrote, had passed beyond all of that. It lived in a state of perfect freedom, asking nothing of God and receiving everything, doing nothing for its own sake and finding that everything was done through it. It was scandalous, this teaching. It remains scandalous in a way even now. Because what Marguerite was saying was that the entire apparatus of medieval Christianity, the priests, the sacraments, the rules, the institutions, was ultimately optional. Necessary for most, perhaps. Useful for many. But not necessary for the soul that had truly surrendered. You can imagine how the bishops felt about this. The book was written over years. We do not know exactly when Marguerite began it, or when she considered it finished. What we know is that at some point she decided to share it, not just with a few trusted friends, but with people who had the authority to judge its contents, and perhaps the authority to approve it. She sent the book to 3 men. The first was a Franciscan friar named John of Quarignon, known for his holiness and his learning. He read it and approved it. He found nothing in it that contradicted the faith. The second was a Cistercian monk named Dom Franco, who taught at the Abbey of Villers in Brabant. He too read it and approved it. The third and most remarkable was Godfrey of Fontaines, a renowned theologian at the University of Paris, one of the most respected intellectual authorities of his age. He read the book carefully. He judged it sound. These approvals mattered. Marguerite was not acting recklessly. She understood that her book was difficult, that it could be misunderstood, that it needed defenders who could vouch for its orthodoxy. And she had found such defenders, not minor figures, but respected men whose judgment carried weight. For a time, this seemed like enough, but the Church was not a single entity with a single opinion. It was a vast and fractured institution, shot through with competing interests and varying degrees of tolerance. The friars who approved the book were not the bishops who governed the dioceses. The theologians of Paris were not the inquisitors who hunted heresy. And in the years after Marguerite began circulating the Mirror of Simple Souls, the climate was changing. The Church was growing more suspicious of popular piety, more anxious about movements it could not control, more willing to see heresy in places where it might have once seen only enthusiasm. The Beguines were particularly vulnerable. They had always existed in a grey zone, and now that grey zone was shrinking. At the Council of Vienne in 1311, just 1 year after Marguerite's death, the Church would formally condemn certain Beguine practices and beliefs, accusing some of them of the very heresy that had been charged against Marguerite. The ground was shifting beneath the feet of women who lived outside the conventional structures of religious life, and Marguerite, with her book and her ideas and her refusal to be quiet, was standing on the most unstable ground of all. The first burning of the Mirror of Simple Souls happened in Valenciennes, sometime between 1296 and 1306. We do not know the exact date. We do not know much about the circumstances. What we know is that the Bishop of Cambrai, a man named Guy de Colmieu, obtained a copy of the book, judged it heretical, and ordered it burned in the public square. And he did something else, something that should have ended the matter but did not. He warned Marguerite. He told her in terms that could not have been unclear that she was never to circulate this book again, that if she did, the consequences would be severe. She circulated it anyway. Try to understand what this means. Marguerite Porete watched her book burn in the town square. She heard the bishop's warning. She knew that the church had the power to imprison her, to torture her, to kill her. And she chose to keep distributing the text. Not secretly, not through underground channels, but openly, sending copies to bishops, to theologians, to anyone she thought might read it and understand. She even sent a copy to the Bishop of Chalons, another high-ranking church official in whose territory she was travelling. This was not the act of someone who misunderstood the danger. This was the act of someone who had weighed the danger against something else, against the truth of what she had written, against the souls she believed needed to hear it, against the love of God that had annihilated everything in her except the need to speak, and found the danger acceptable. We do not have her words explaining this decision. We do not have letters or journals or any record of her inner reasoning, but we have her actions, and her actions say everything. She had written a book that she believed was true. She had been told to stop sharing it. She refused. Not because she wanted to be a martyr, necessarily, but because she could not pretend she had not written what she had written, could not deny the God she had encountered, could not close the door that had been opened in her. Sometime around 1308, Marguerite Porete was arrested. The charge was relapsed heresy committed again, after having been warned. She was taken to Paris to the custody of the Inquisitor William Humbert, the Dominican friar charged with investigating cases of doctrinal error within the French kingdom. And there, in the prisons that served the Inquisition, she began her silence. 18 months. That is how long Marguerite Porete refused to speak. The inquisitorial process depended on cooperation. It was designed, in its own terrible way, to give the accused a chance to repent. The inquisitors would question the suspect. They would explain the errors in their beliefs. They would offer the opportunity to confess, to recant, to be reconciled with the church. If the suspect cooperated, if they admitted their errors and asked for forgiveness, the penalties could be relatively light. Penance, perhaps, imprisonment in some cases, but not death. The church did not want to kill people, it wanted to save souls. And saving souls in the inquisitorial framework meant bringing heretics back into the fold. But none of this could work if the accused refused to participate. And Marguerite refused. From the moment of her arrest, or very nearly from the beginning, she declined to speak. She would not answer the inquisitors' questions. She would not engage with the theologians who were brought to evaluate her book. She would not swear the oath that was required of all those who appeared before the Inquisition. The oath to tell the truth, to answer fully, to cooperate with the investigation. This was unprecedented. The inquisitors did not know what to do with a suspect who simply declined to play the game. They tried persuasion, they tried threats, they tried waiting, hoping that the isolation and discomfort of prison would break her resistance. It did not work. She remained silent. We cannot know what she was thinking during those 18 months. Was she praying, meditating, communing with the God she had described so intimately in her book? Had she already, in some spiritual sense, annihilated herself so completely that there was no self left to respond to questions, no will left to defend? Or was she simply refusing, with the last stubborn core of her being, to participate in a process she considered illegitimate? The book offers some clues. In The Mirror of Simple Souls, Marguerite describes the annihilated soul as one that has passed beyond caring about earthly things, beyond caring even about its own salvation, in the conventional sense, because it has already surrendered everything to God. Such a soul, she writes, does not defend itself. It does not explain itself. It does not argue or plead or negotiate. It simply is what it is, resting in divine love, indifferent to the judgments of the world. Perhaps her silence was the final expression of her teaching. Perhaps she had become, in those prison months, the very thing she had written about. A soul so emptied of self that it could not even summon the words to save itself. Or perhaps she was making a statement, refusing to grant the Inquisition the legitimacy it demanded, declining to engage with a system she considered blind to the truths she had experienced. We cannot know, she did not tell us. That was the point. On April 11th, 1310, the case was brought to a close. William Humber convened a council of theologians, 21 of them canon lawyers and masters of theology, the finest minds the University of Paris had to offer. They were asked to evaluate two things, the book and the woman's silence. The book, they concluded, was heretical. It contained errors against the faith. It taught that the soul could become so united with God that it no longer needed the sacraments, no longer needed the virtues, no longer needed the church itself. These were not ambiguous conclusions. The theologians were unanimous, or nearly so. The Mirror of Simple Souls was condemned. But what about the author? This was more complicated. Marguerite had not confessed to anything. She had not defended her book, but she had not recanted it either. She had simply refused to participate. The theologians wrestled with this. In the end, they concluded that her refusal to swear the oath, her persistent absolute refusal to engage with the inquisitorial process, was itself a kind of confession. By refusing to speak, she had tacitly admitted that she could not defend herself. By refusing to recant, she had tacitly affirmed that she stood by what she had written. Her silence was not neutrality, it was a statement. And so, she was condemned as a relapsed heretic, which meant that there would be no mercy. A first-time heretic who repented could be pardoned. A heretic who had been warned and offended again, who had watched her book burn and continued to distribute it anyway, had forfeited her chance at reconciliation. The penalty was death by fire. On May 30th, 1310, the sentence was read publicly in Paris. The following day, June 1st, Marguerite Porete was taken to the Place de Grève and burned at the stake. The record notes that she showed great signs of piety and devotion as she went to her death. She did not scream, she did not beg. She faced the fire with the same silence she had maintained for 18 months. And they threw the book in with her. They burned the pages alongside her body, the ink and the parchment curling and blackening in the same flames that consumed her flesh. They thought they were destroying it. They thought they were ending the danger. They were wrong. The fire took what it could take. The woman was gone. The copies in Paris were gone. The inquisitors congratulated themselves on a job done well, a heresy extinguished, a threat neutralized. They moved on to other cases, other suspects, other dangers. Within a few years, William Humber would be dead himself, his work absorbed into the larger machinery of the church. Within a few decades, almost no one would remember Marguerite Porete's name, but the book remembered itself. Here is what the inquisitors did not know, could not have known. The Mirror of Simple Souls had already escaped. Before Marguerite's arrest, before the trial, before the fire, copies had been made and sent across borders. The approval letters from the Franciscan friar and the Cistercian monk and the Parisian theologian had circulated alongside the text, giving it a stamp of legitimacy that clung even after the author's condemnation. And once a text begins to travel in the medieval world, it is almost impossible to stop. Within decades of Marguerite's death, Latin translations appeared. The book found readers in Italy, in England, in the German lands. It was copied by monks who recognized in its pages something profound and beautiful, who may not have known, or may not have cared, that its author had been condemned. The language of annihilation, of surrender, of love that dissolves the self, these ideas resonated with the mystical tradition that was flowering across Europe. The book fit into a conversation that was already happening, a conversation about contemplation and union with the divine. But something strange had happened to it in transit. The author's name was gone. The copies that survived did not bear Marguerite Porete's name. Instead, they were attributed to other writers, to men, usually, whose names carried safety rather than suspicion. The Latin translation that circulated in Italy was anonymous, or attributed to an unknown friar. The Middle English translation, which appeared in England in the 15th century, circulated without any author's name at all. Scholars who studied these texts debated their origins, proposed various candidates, and did not think to look for a woman burned at the stake 200 years before. The book lived, the name died. For 6 centuries, the Mirror of Simple Souls was read and copied and discussed by people who had no idea that its author had been executed for writing it. They read her words about divine love and the annihilation of the self, and they found them moving or challenging or profound, and they never once suspected that these words had cost someone her life. It was not until 1946 that the truth began to resurface. A scholar named Romana Guarnieri was studying medieval mystical texts when she noticed something odd. The condemnation of Marguerite Porete, preserved in the inquisitorial records, quoted passages from her book. And those passages, the Latin translations of them at least, sounded familiar. They sounded like passages from a text that Guarnieri knew, a text that had been circulating for centuries under other names. She began to compare. Line by line, passage by passage, she matched the quotations in the trial records with the anonymous manuscripts. The correspondence was unmistakable. The book that had been passed down through the centuries, the book that had been attributed to anonymous friars or unknown mystics, was the same book that Marguerite Porete had been burned for writing. The discovery was momentous. It meant that one of the most significant mystical texts of the medieval period, a text that had influenced generations of spiritual writers, a text that had been preserved and treasured by readers who had no idea of its origins, was the work of a condemned woman, a woman whose name had been erased from her own creation, a woman whose death was supposed to mean the death of her ideas. Romana Guarnieri published her findings. Scholars began to re-examine the manuscript tradition, tracing the paths by which the text had travelled, identifying the moments where the author's name had been lost or replaced. The picture that emerged was extraordinary. Marguerite Porete had not been forgotten because her work was insignificant. She had been forgotten because her work was too significant, too valuable, too resonant, to let die with her. The people who preserved the book had preserved it precisely by hiding its origins, by stripping away the name that would have condemned it, by letting it circulate as an orphan text that could be read without fear. The irony is staggering. The Church burned Marguerite Porete to silence her ideas, and her ideas survived precisely because they were valuable enough for other people to protect, to copy, to pass on through centuries of anonymous transmission. The fire accomplished nothing except to separate the author from her work. The work itself went on, untouched by the flames, carrying within it the vision of a woman who had seen something about divine love and had refused to unsay it. Think for a moment about what it means to write something under your own name, to put your thoughts into words, to shape those words on a page, to send them out into the world attached to the person you are. Every writer does this, in one form or another. Every writer accepts at some level that the text will carry their identity with it, that readers will know or learn or discover who made this thing. Marguerite Porete wrote The Mirror of Simple Souls, and she signed it with her life. She did not hide behind a pseudonym. She did not publish anonymously. She claimed the book as her own, defended it to bishops, circulated it under her name even after being warned that doing so could kill her. And then she was killed, and the book lived on, and her name was stripped away. For 600 years she was a ghost. Her words were read. Her existence was not remembered. Monks copied her sentences without knowing whose hand had first written them. Mystics found comfort in her vision of annihilated love without realizing that the vision had been paid for in fire and ash. She had spoken and been silenced, and somehow kept speaking through centuries of anonymous transmission, her voice persisting even when no one knew whose voice it was. There is something almost unbearably poignant about this, and there is something almost miraculous. The Inquisition had at its disposal the full power of the medieval church, the prisons, the torturers, the executioners, the theologians who could declare a text heretical and a woman damned. It had the fire itself, the ultimate instrument of destruction, the flame that was supposed to purify by consuming, and it failed. Not entirely, not in the short term. Marguerite died, and her immediate circle was silenced, and for a generation or two no one dared to speak her name. But in the long arc of history, the book survived. The ideas survived. The vision of a soul so lost in God that it no longer needed anything else. That vision travelled farther and lasted longer than the institution that tried to destroy it. We're still reading her words today. We are still grappling with what they mean. The woman who was supposed to be erased has been restored to her book, and the book has been restored to its history, and something that was meant to end in the Place de Grève on a June morning in 1310 has instead continued for more than 7 centuries. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We have followed the book to its survival, to its rediscovery, to its strange afterlife in the hands of scholars who finally understood whose name belonged on the cover. But we have not yet gone deeply enough into the book itself, into the world that Marguerite described, the God she encountered, the annihilation she taught. To understand why she was willing to die for these words, we have to understand what the words meant to her. And to understand that, we need to open the book. We need to hear love speak, and reason argue, and the soul describe its long journey toward disappearing into the divine. We need to enter the mirror of simple souls not as a historical artifact, but as a living text, a document of someone's encounter with the Absolute. That is where we will go next, into the pages that outlasted the fire, into the vision that cost a woman everything and gave her, perhaps, everything in return. The Mirror of Simple Souls is not a treatise. It is not a theological argument arranged in careful propositions, the way the schoolmen of Paris would have written. It is not a sermon, though it sometimes preaches. It is not a confession, though it sometimes confesses. What it is, more than anything else, is a drama, a conversation between allegorical figures who speak to one another across the pages, debating, questioning, teaching, sometimes falling silent in the presence of something too large for words. And the central figure in this drama, the voice that guides the reader through the landscape of the soul's transformation, is not Marguerite herself. It is love. Love speaks in the mirror the way a teacher speaks to a bewildered student, patiently, persistently, circling back to the same truths again and again because the truths are difficult and the student keeps stumbling. Love explains. Love persuades. Love describes what the annihilated soul looks like from the inside, how it feels to lose yourself so completely in the divine that there is no longer a self to lose. And opposing love, questioning love, resisting love's more radical claims is reason. Reason is not a villain in this drama. Reason is simply limited. Reason can see as far as the human mind can see, which is very far indeed, but not far enough. Reason can understand the commandments, the sacraments, the structures of virtue and obedience that the Church has built. What reason cannot understand is what happens when the soul passes beyond all structure, beyond all effort, into a state where it no longer needs to try because it has become what it was trying to reach. This is the heart of Marguerite's vision, the burning centre around which everything else revolves. The soul, she teaches, can be annihilated in love, not destroyed in the sense of ceasing to exist, but emptied of all that is not God until only God remains. The soul in this state has no will of its own because its will has become God's will. It has no desire because all desire has been fulfilled. It does not practice virtue in the ordinary sense because virtue implies effort, implies a self that is working towards something, and the annihilated soul is past all working. It simply is what it is, which is nothing at all and everything at once. It has fallen into the sea of divine love and forgotten that it was ever a separate drop. You can hear, perhaps, why this was dangerous. You can hear the echoes of accusations that would be levelled against it. If the soul no longer needs to practice virtue, does that mean it can sin freely? If the soul no longer needs the sacraments, does that mean the Church is unnecessary? If the soul is united with God so completely that its will is God's will, does that mean anything it chooses to do is automatically holy? These were the questions the inquisitors asked. These were the conclusions they drew, whether or not Marguerite herself had drawn them. And in a sense, the questions were not unfair. The mirror does teach something that cuts against the foundations of institutional religion. It does suggest that there is a state of the soul where all the structures fall away, not because the structures are wrong, but because they are scaffolding, and scaffolding is meant to be removed once the building stands. But to read the mirror only as a threat to church authority is to miss what it actually feels like to encounter the text. It is not a book of rebellion. It is a book of longing. Every page aches with the desire for God, the kind of desire that makes everything else seem small, the kind of desire that would give up everything, virtue, identity, the very capacity to desire, if it could only reach its object. Marguerite did not write this book because she wanted to undermine the Church. She wrote it because she had touched something, or believed she had touched something, that made the ordinary categories inadequate. She was trying to describe an experience that broke the container of description, and she was trying to help others reach the same place, to show them the path that led through the territories of spiritual effort and out the other side into the wild country where effort ceases and love simply is. The book is structured around a journey. Though the journey does not move in a straight line, Marguerite describes 7 states of the soul, 7 stages through which it passes on its way to annihilation. The early states are familiar from conventional spiritual teaching. The soul resolves to keep God's commandments. The soul pursues the perfection of evangelical counsels. The soul grows in charity and self-denial. These are the rungs of a ladder that every devout Christian was taught to climb. But then something strange happens. The soul reaches a point where the ladder ends and there is nothing but open sky. It enters what Marguerite calls the state of the free soul, the soul that has been liberated from all the constraints that once defined it, the soul that lives without a why. Without a why. This phrase appears again and again in the mirror, and it is one of the keys to understanding what Marguerite meant. The soul that lives without a why does not act for the sake of reward or punishment. It does not love God in order to get something from God. It does not practice virtue in order to be virtuous. It does not even seek union with God as though union were a goal to be achieved. It simply exists in the place it has always already been, no longer striving because there is nothing left to strive for. The rose does not bloom for a reason. It blooms because it is a rose. The annihilated soul does not love for a reason. It loves because it has become love itself. This is mystical theology at its most radical, and it places Marguerite in a lineage that stretches back through centuries of Christian thought and forward into traditions she could not have known she was anticipating. There are echoes here of Meister Eckhart, the great Dominican preacher who would face his own difficulties with church authorities just a few years after Marguerite's death. There are anticipations of Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, the Spanish mystics who would describe similar states of union in the 16th century. There are resonances with the Rhineland mystics, with Flemish spirituality, with strands of contemplative practice that wove through medieval Europe like underground rivers. Marguerite was not alone in what she experienced or what she tried to describe, but she was perhaps more uncompromising than most in following the logic of annihilation to its conclusions. Consider what it would mean, really mean, to have no will of your own. Not in the sense of being forced to obey someone else, but in the sense of having passed beyond the experience of willing at all. The ordinary person says, I want this, I choose that, I will do the other thing. The annihilated soul no longer speaks in this way, because there is no longer an I to do the wanting. The soul has become transparent, a window through which the divine light shines without obstruction. Or, to use another of Marguerite's images, the soul has become a mirror, hence the title, reflecting God back to God without adding anything of its own. The mirror does not decide what to reflect. The mirror does not interfere with the light. The mirror simply is what it is. Pure receptivity, pure passivity, pure openness to whatever comes. This passivity troubled the inquisitors deeply, and it has troubled readers ever since. Does Marguerite mean that the soul should do nothing? Does she mean that effort is worthless? That spiritual practice is a waste of time? That one should simply wait for annihilation to happen? The answer is more subtle than that, though the subtlety was perhaps lost on those who judged her. The mirror does not reject the early stages of the spiritual life. It describes them carefully and honours them as necessary. The soul must pass through effort on its way to effortlessness. The soul must practice virtue before it can transcend virtue. The ladder exists and must be climbed before it can be left behind. What Marguerite rejects is not the journey, but the mistake of thinking that the journey is the destination, the mistake of clinging to the scaffolding as though it were the building itself. And here we come to one of the most provocative passages in the entire book, a passage that would be extracted and quoted at Marguerite's trial, a passage that crystallized everything the Church feared about her teaching. Love, speaking in the text, describes the free soul in these terms. It gives to nature all that nature requires, without remorse of conscience. The soul does not refuse nature's demands, because it no longer has the capacity to refuse. It does not struggle against desire, because it no longer experiences desire as something separate from itself. It lives in a state of such profound freedom that the concepts of permission and prohibition no longer apply to it. Whatever it does without sin, because sin requires a will that chooses wrongly, and the annihilated soul has no will to choose. Read one way, this is a license for antinomianism, the heretical belief that those who have reached spiritual perfection are above the moral law. Read another way, it is a description of a state so rare and so elevated that almost no one will ever reach it. a state in which the question of license does not arise because the soul would never be moved to do anything that violated love. Marguerite, it seems, intended the second reading, but the inquisitors, perhaps understandably, heard the first, and once they heard it, once they decided that the mirror taught that the spiritual elite could do whatever they pleased, the book's fate was sealed. It did not matter that Marguerite might have meant something entirely different. It did not matter that the passage in question was embedded in a complex dialogue full of qualifications and warnings. What mattered was what the passage sounded like to hostile ears, and to hostile ears it sounded like blasphemy. The theologians of Paris extracted 21 propositions from the mirror and declared them heretical. We still have the list. The soul in this state, according to the condemned propositions, no longer cares about indulgences or penances. It has no desire for heaven or fear of hell. It gives to nature whatever nature desires. It no longer needs to practice virtue because virtue has become its very substance. It is free of all things and bound to nothing. It does not pray for those in purgatory or seek the intercession of saints. It is so unified with God that God could not exist without it. This last proposition is perhaps the most radical of all. The claim that the annihilated soul has become so essential to God that divine existence itself depends on it. Whether Marguerite actually meant this, or whether the inquisitors were reading their own worst fears into her words, we cannot entirely know. The text is difficult. The text is paradoxical. The text plays with language in ways that deliberately push against the limits of what can be said. But the inquisitors were not interested in hermeneutic nuance. They were interested in order. They were interested in maintaining the structures that held Christendom together. The authority of priests to forgive sins, the necessity of sacraments for salvation, the obligation of all Christians to obey the Church's teachings and submit to its judgments. Marguerite's book, whatever it actually said, whatever it actually meant, was a threat to these structures. It suggested that there was a path to God that did not pass through the proper channels. It implied that the soul could reach a state where the Church became, if not irrelevant, at least unnecessary. And the Church, understandably, did not want to be unnecessary, so they burned the book. We know that copies of the mirror were destroyed by fire at least once before Marguerite herself was executed, during an earlier condemnation, when she was warned never to circulate the text again. And we know that copies were thrown into the flames along with her body on that June morning in Paris. The fire was supposed to consume both the woman and her words. The fire was supposed to settle the matter once and for all. But fire, as it turns out, is not as powerful as ideas. Fire cannot reach across borders into the hands of sympathetic readers. Fire cannot prevent a book from being copied in secret, from travelling under assumed names, from finding new audiences in new languages and new centuries. The inquisitors controlled the Place de Grève. They did not control the future, and the future slowly, quietly kept reading. The mirror survived in Latin translation and in several vernacular versions. It circulated among monks and nuns who had no idea that its author had been burned as a heretic. It was copied into manuscripts that identified the author as a man, or as no one at all, or simply as an anonymous soul describing its encounter with God. The name Marguerite Porete vanished from the tradition, but the words remained. The vision remained. The description of annihilation, of the soul drowning in the sea of love, of the self dissolving until only God was left. This description continued to touch readers, to move them, to shape their understanding of what union with the divine might mean. The book became what Marguerite had always said the soul should become: anonymous, selfless, without a why. It existed for its own sake, asking nothing, claiming nothing, simply offering its truths to whoever was willing to receive them. 6 centuries passed before scholars began to piece together what had happened. The process of rediscovery was slow and painstaking, the work of archivists and historians digging through documents that had been overlooked or forgotten. Someone noticed that the Latin mirror resembled accounts of a French text mentioned in trial records from the early 14th century. Someone else connected those trial records to the case of a woman burned in Paris for refusing to recant her teachings. Connections were made, comparisons drawn, handwriting analysed, linguistic evidence weighed, and finally, in the 20th century, the identity of the author was established beyond reasonable doubt. The anonymous text had a name again. The ghost had a face. Marguerite Porete stepped back into history, 700 years after history had tried to erase her. We know now, more or less, who she was and what she wrote and why she died for it. We know the outlines of the story, even if many of the details have been lost. But there is one part of the story that we have not yet fully entered, one period of Margaret's life that stands apart from everything that came before or after, and that is the 1.5 years she spent in prison, waiting for a verdict that she must have known would condemn her, maintaining a silence that the Inquisition could not break. To understand who Marguerite Porete was, we need to understand that silence. We need to enter those months of darkness and stillness, to sit with a woman who had nothing left but her refusal to speak. We need to ask why she chose silence, and what she was saying by saying nothing at all. The records tell us that she was arrested sometime in late 1308 or early 1309. The exact date is uncertain, lost in the gaps that pockmark medieval documentation. She was taken to Paris and placed in the custody of the Inquisition, which at that time operated from a prison attached to the Dominican convent of Saint-Jacques. We do not know what her cell looked like, though we can imagine it from what we know of similar prisons in that era. A small, dark room, cold in winter, insufficiently ventilated in summer, furnished with little more than straw for sleeping and a bucket for bodily necessities. She would have been fed, but not well. She would have been questioned repeatedly by men trained in the art of extracting confessions from those accused of heresy. And she would have been offered, again and again, the chance to save herself by recanting. Recantation was always possible. The Inquisition preferred repentance to execution. A heretic who confessed, who abjured their errors, who submitted to the authority of the Church and accepted whatever penance was imposed, such a person could be reconciled, could be saved, could return to the fold of Christian society. Marguerite had every opportunity to take this path. All she had to do was stand before her judges, admit that she'd been wrong, declare that the mirror of simple souls contained errors, and promise never to teach or circulate such ideas again. She had done something similar once before, years earlier, when the Bishop of Cambrai had first condemned the book. She had sworn not to distribute the text. She had accepted the bishop's judgment. And then, at some point, she had changed her mind and begun circulating the book again, which is what led to her final arrest. Now she was being given one more chance, one final opportunity to save her life by renouncing her vision. She refused, not by arguing, not by defending herself, not by engaging with the theological objections raised against her. She refused by falling silent. For 18 months, from the beginning of her imprisonment to the final act of her trial, Marguerite Porete declined to speak. She would not answer the Inquisition's questions. She would not take the oath that all defendants were required to swear before testimony could begin. She would not participate in the proceedings that were designed to judge her. She simply stood, or sat, or knelt, and said nothing at all. The records describe her as being asked repeatedly to take the oath, and as refusing consistently to do so. They describe the frustration of her interrogators, who had never encountered such obstinance. They describe the legal dilemma her silence created, for how could a trial proceed when the defendant would not even acknowledge its legitimacy? What was she doing? What was she thinking in those long months of captivity as she waited for the inevitable end? We cannot know for certain. The silence speaks, but it does not explain itself. Some scholars have suggested that she was making a final theological statement, practicing in her own body the annihilation she had preached in her book. The soul that has been lost in God has no will of its own, no capacity for self-defense, no stake in its own survival. Perhaps Margaret's silence was a demonstration of what such a soul looks like when it encounters the powers of this world. It does not resist because it has nothing to protect. It does not argue because it has nothing to prove. It simply is what it is, transparent, empty, beyond the reach of those who would compel it to be something else. Or perhaps she was simply exhausted. Perhaps after years of writing, years of teaching, years of defending her vision against authorities who could not or would not understand it, she had finally reached the point where words seemed useless. She had tried to explain. She had tried to make them see, and they had responded with condemnation, with imprisonment, with the threat of fire. What more was there to say? The book existed. The book spoke for itself. Anyone who could hear its message would hear it. Anyone who could not hear it would not be persuaded by further argument. She had done what she was called to do. The rest was not up to her. There is something almost peaceful in this interpretation, something that fits with the vision of surrender and release that the mirror describes. But we should be careful not to romanticize what was, after all, a terrible situation. Marguerite was in prison, facing death. She may have been tortured. We do not know for certain, but the Inquisition did use torture in other cases, and her interrogators would have been under pressure to break her silence. She was alone, or nearly alone, cut off from whatever community had supported her before her arrest. The followers who had once gathered to hear her teachings had dispersed or gone into hiding. The churchmen who had approved her book in earlier years had distanced themselves or turned against her. She had no powerful protector, no influential advocate, no one who could intervene on her behalf. She had only her silence and her God, and the 18 months stretching out before her like a road with a known ending. And still she did not speak. Still she did not bend. The Inquisition tried everything it knew how to try. It brought in theologians to explain the errors in her book. It offered her chances to confess privately if public confession seemed too humiliating. It warned her of the consequences, described in vivid terms what awaited those who persisted in heresy. And she remained silent. Silent as the days turned to weeks, the weeks to months. Silent as the seasons changed outside her cell, as the world went on without her, as the verdict that would end her life slowly crystallized in the deliberations of her judges. Finally, in the spring of 1310, the Inquisitor came to his conclusion. Marguerite Porete had written a heretical book. She had circulated it in defiance of church authority. She had refused to participate in the trial that sought to determine her guilt. And most damningly, she had refused to abjure, refused to renounce her errors, to submit to the church's judgment, to accept reconciliation on the church's terms. This made her what the medieval legal system called a relapsed heretic, someone who had been condemned once, had apparently submitted, and then had fallen back into the same errors. The penalty for relapsed heresy was death. The sentence was pronounced on the last day of May. She was declared guilty. She was handed over to the secular authorities for execution, following the legal fiction by which the church avoided directly shedding blood. And on June 1st, 1310, in the Place de Grève in Paris, with a crowd gathered to watch and copies of her book piled at her feet, Marguerite Porete was burned. The chroniclers who were present, or who recorded accounts from those who were present, note something remarkable about how she died. They say that she showed no fear. They say that she faced the flames with what they called great signs of piety and devotion. One account describes her moving the crowd to tears, though whether those tears were of pity or of religious awe or of something harder to name, we cannot know. She had written about the soul that has passed beyond fear and hope, that no longer clings to anything because it has nothing left to cling to. Perhaps, in those final moments, she discovered that she had already become what she had described. Perhaps the annihilation she had taught was real, and the woman who walked to the stake was already no longer Marguerite, already dissolved into the love that she had spent her life trying to name. Or perhaps she was simply terrified, and the piety the witnesses saw was the piety of someone holding on to the only thing she had left. We cannot know. The moment belongs to her, and she did not share it. She stepped into the fire, and the fire closed around her, and she was gone, and the smoke rose into the June sky over Paris, and the ashes fell and were swept away, and the world went on. Bishops continued to issue decrees. Scholars continued to copy manuscripts. The Inquisition continued to hunt for heretics in other cities, other countries, other centuries. And somewhere, in monasteries and convents far from Paris, copies of a book called The Mirror of Simple Souls continued to circulate, their pages turning in quiet cells, their words entering the minds of readers who did not know whose life had paid for them. The book should have died with her. That was the point of burning the copies alongside the woman who wrote them, to erase not just the body but the idea, to scatter both into the same indifferent ash. The Inquisition understood in its way the power of written words. It understood that a dangerous thought, once set down on parchment, could travel further than any preacher, could slip through borders that soldiers could not cross, could speak to readers not yet born in years not yet imagined. And so when Marguerite Porete burned, her book burned with her, and the authorities must have believed that the matter was settled, that the problem had been solved in the only way such problems could be solved. But fire, it turns out, is not as thorough as those who wield it might wish. A book is not a single object. A book is every copy of itself that has ever been made, every hand that has ever transcribed it, every reader who has ever memorized a passage and carried it away in the silent library of their own mind. You can burn a woman, you can burn the manuscript found in her possession, but you cannot burn a thought that has already escaped into the world, cannot chase down every copy that has already slipped away into other hands, other cities, other centuries. And so, the mirror of simple souls survived. Not openly, not defiantly, but quietly, secretly, in the way that certain ideas have always survived the attempts of power to extinguish them. It survived because someone, somewhere before the flames, had made another copy, or because several someones had. We do not know their names, we do not know their faces. We do not know if they were friends of Marguerite who sensed what was coming and acted to preserve her words, or strangers who had simply been moved by the book and wished to keep it, or scribes who had copied it for pay without understanding what it was they were copying. What we know is that the book continued to exist after the woman who wrote it had ceased to exist, and that it continued to circulate hand to hand, monastery to monastery, across the decades and the centuries that followed. But here is the strange part, the part that would have seemed to Marguerite's inquisitors like a final victory, and that seems to us like a kind of second death. The book survived, but her name did not. Somewhere in the years after her execution, as the copies multiplied and travelled, Marguerite Porete's name was removed from the text. Perhaps it was deliberate, a scribe recognising that a book written by a condemned heretic would be dangerous to own, and so erasing the dangerous name to protect himself and future readers. Perhaps it was accidental, a copying error, a worn page, a place where the attribution simply failed to transfer from one manuscript to the next. We do not know how it happened, we only know that it did. The book continued to circulate, but now it circulated under other names. In some versions, it was attributed to no one at all. In others, it was ascribed to figures of unimpeachable orthodoxy, to famous male theologians, to respected church fathers, to saints whose reputations placed the text beyond suspicion. The words remained the same, the radical theology of annihilation, of the soul dissolved into divine love, of freedom from the church's demands. All of it remained, word for word as Marguerite had written it. But the woman behind those words had vanished, erased as thoroughly as if she had never existed. Try to imagine what that means. Try to imagine writing something that captures the deepest truth you know, something that costs you everything, including your life, and then watching from some impossible vantage as your name is peeled away from your words, as someone else's name is pasted over the space where yours used to be, as your book walks on through history wearing a borrowed face. For 600 years, readers encountered the mirror of simple souls, and never knew that a woman had written it. For 600 years, scholars studied its theology and debated its meaning, and placed it in the context of male mystical traditions. And the woman who had actually lived the annihilation the book described, who had walked to her death rather than renounce it, was not even a rumour, not even a ghost. She had been erased so completely that no one even knew there was something missing. The book travelled far. It was translated into Middle English and reached England, where it found readers in the 14th and 15th centuries. It was translated into Italian and circulated among spiritual communities in the Italian peninsula. It was translated into Latin, the language of scholarship and theology, which allowed it to enter the libraries of universities and monasteries where it might otherwise have been excluded. In each language, in each new copying, the text adapted to its new home, picked up new readers, continued its strange quiet journey through medieval Christian thought. And in each language, in each new copying, Marguerite Porete remained invisible, her authorship buried beneath the names of others or beneath the anonymity of unsigned spiritual texts. Some of these copies attributed the book to Jan van Ruusbroek, the Flemish mystic whose own writings explored similar themes of contemplative union with God. Others attributed it to unknown or invented figures. The English translation circulated under no name at all, or was vaguely associated with the Carthusian spiritual tradition. Readers who encountered the book in England had no reason to connect it to a woman burned in Paris nearly a century before they were born. They read it as an anonymous gift from the tradition, a voice emerging from the accumulated wisdom of Christian contemplation, a text whose origins were lost in the mists of spiritual history. And yet, and this is the part that matters most, the book continued to unsettle its readers. Even stripped of its author's name, even disguised as the work of orthodox male mystics, the Mirror of Simple Souls retained its radical edge. Its theology was too strange, too uncompromising, to be smoothed away by anonymous circulation. It still taught that the soul could reach a state of perfection in which it no longer needed the guidance of the Church. It still taught that such a soul could set aside the practices of formal religion, prayer, fasting, confession, the sacraments themselves, because it had passed beyond the need for them. It still taught that virtue itself could become an obstacle, that the soul in the higher state of love no longer practiced virtues deliberately because it had become virtue, had become love, had become something that no longer had a separate self to practice anything at all. These were not safe ideas. They had not become safe simply because their author had been burned. And so, even as the Mirror of Simple Souls circulated under borrowed names and anonymous attributions, it continued to attract suspicion. Church authorities who encountered it recognized its dangerous implications even when they did not know where it had come from. In the late 14th century, when the text reached England, it came under scrutiny from bishops worried about the spread of heresy among the English laity. The translation was examined, debated, approached with the same nervous caution that Marguerite's original had attracted nearly a century earlier, and yet it was not suppressed. It continued to circulate, continued to find readers, continued to speak its strange message of annihilation and freedom to those who had ears to hear it. There is something almost miraculous about this survival, something that resists easy explanation. Books that are truly dangerous, books that threaten the foundations of institutional power, are not supposed to survive their authors' executions. They are supposed to be hunted down and destroyed, every copy tracked and burned, every scribe who made a copy punished, every reader who owned a copy forced to surrender it. That is how power protects itself from ideas it cannot absorb. And yet, despite the best efforts of the Inquisition, despite the flames that consumed Marguerite and the copies piled at her feet, the book slipped through. It slipped through because books are not objects. They are patterns, and patterns can be copied, can multiply, can travel through human minds faster than any inquisitor can follow. Think of the hands that preserved it. Unknown hands working in quiet rooms, by candlelight or the pale grey light of monastery windows. Hands that held quills and dipped them in oak gall ink and traced letter by letter the words that Marguerite Porete had first set down decades earlier. We do not know if these copyists understood what they were preserving. We do not know if they believed the theology they were transcribing, or if they copied mechanically as part of their work, without attending to the meaning of the words passing through their hands. We do not know if any of them paused, reading a passage about the soul annihilated in love, and felt something stir in them, some recognition, some answering call from a depth within themselves they had not known was there. The copyists are as invisible to us as Marguerite became invisible to the readers of her book. They did their work and the work survived, and they themselves vanished into the silence of history, leaving only the manuscripts behind. The manuscripts themselves are strange objects to hold. If you're ever lucky enough to encounter one in a library or an archive, they are pieces of animal skin, vellum calf or sheep or goat, prepared and stretched and smoothed until they became surfaces that could hold ink. They are the work of many hands, the hand that prepared the skin, the hand that ruled the lines, the hand that wrote the words, the hand that bound the pages, the hands that turned them over centuries of reading. Each manuscript is unique. No two copies are exactly alike, because each was made individually, by a human being working slowly through the text, making small errors and small corrections, adding small flourishes or omitting small words, leaving the traces of their presence in every variation from the copy they worked from. To read a medieval manuscript is to read something that was made, deliberately and laboriously, by someone who wanted it to exist. To read a surviving copy of the Mirror of Simple Souls is to read a book that survived because someone decided it should survive. Someone whose name we will never know. Someone who may have understood what they were doing or may simply have been doing their work day after day, word after word, preserving without knowing what they preserved. For 600 years the book circulated under false names or no name at all. For 600 years Marguerite Porete was forgotten so completely that even scholars who studied medieval mysticism, even experts who knew the text intimately, did not know she had ever existed. The silence she chose in her prison cell extended far beyond her death. It became a silence about her, a forgetting that lasted longer than many civilizations, longer than empires, longer than the institutions that had condemned her. And then, in the 20th century, something changed. A scholar named Romana Guarnieri was working in the Vatican archives in the 1940s, pursuing research into medieval religious movements, and she found something that should not have been there. She found a document, a list of condemned heretical propositions, that matched point-for-point passages in the Mirror of Simple Souls, and the document named the author of those propositions. It named Marguerite Porete, the Beguine, burned in Paris in 1310. The discovery was quiet at first, the way such discoveries often are. Guarnieri published her findings in Italian academic journals, and other scholars took notice, and slowly, over the following decades, the truth of Marguerite's authorship was established beyond reasonable doubt. The book that had travelled for 6 centuries under borrowed names was finally returned to the woman who had written it. The author who had been erased was finally visible again, stepping out of the anonymity that had protected her text and obscured her existence, reclaiming her place in the history of thought. It is difficult to convey what this recovery means, because we have become accustomed to knowing what we know. To read the Mirror of Simple Souls today is to read a book by Marguerite Porete, a 13th century Beguine mystic burned for heresy in Paris in 1310. The author's name appears on the cover, in the introduction, in the footnotes that explain the text's history. We take her authorship for granted because we know it, because we learned it, because scholars did the work of recovering it and passing it on. But for 600 years, no one knew. For 600 years, readers encountered one of the most radical spiritual texts of the medieval period, and had no idea that it had been written by a woman, by someone who died for writing it, by someone whose entire existence had been carefully and systematically forgotten. What does it mean to recover a forgotten author? What does it mean for a name to return after 6 centuries of absence? In one sense, it changes nothing about the text itself. The words remain the words Marguerite wrote. The theology remains the theology that frightened the bishops and moved the readers and survived the flames. The book does not become a different book simply because we now know who wrote it. And yet, in another sense, everything changes. To know that the Mirror of Simple Souls was written by a woman transforms our understanding of what the text is, what it meant, what it cost. It places the abstract theology back into a living context. It reminds us that the soul annihilated in love was not just a concept, but a description of something someone actually experienced, actually lived, actually died for. It returns the body to the idea. And it reveals something else, something that reaches beyond Marguerite Porete to touch the entire history of women's thought. How many other books have travelled under false names? How many other women have been erased from texts they wrote, their authorship replaced by the names of men who never held the pen, their contributions absorbed into traditions that refuse to acknowledge them? We cannot know. We can only know that it happened at least once, that the case of Marguerite Porete is not a hypothesis but a fact, that a woman's work was taken from her and given to others, and only recovered by centuries of patient scholarship. And if it happened once, we must assume it happened again, and again, and again, in cases that have never been discovered, in erasures that have never been reversed. The archives are full of anonymous texts. Some of them are anonymous because their authors are genuinely unknown, and some of them, perhaps many of them, are anonymous because someone made them that way. Marguerite's book survived because it was too alive to die. Her name vanished because the world was not ready to remember a woman who had stood against the church and refused to bend. The combination of survival and forgetting tells us something important about how ideas travel through time. They do not travel cleanly, carrying their origins with them. They travel messily, shedding pieces of themselves, acquiring new attributions, transforming as they pass from hand to hand. The history of thought is not the history of great men producing great books. It is the history of countless anonymous hands, countless quiet acts of preservation and transmission, countless decisions, some deliberate, some accidental, about what to save and what to discard, what to remember and what to forget. For Marguerite Porete, the forgetting lasted longer than any human memory could span. Generations lived and died without knowing her name. The book she wrote continued to move through the world, speaking to readers in languages she had never spoken, in centuries she could not have imagined, and she was nowhere in it. Her voice remained, but her name was gone. Her thought remained, but her body, burned to ash in a Paris square, seemed to have taken her identity with it into the flames. And then she came back, slowly, through the patient work of scholars, through the careful examination of documents long unread, through the gradual accumulation of evidence that could no longer be ignored. Romana Guarnieri found the connection that had been lost. Other scholars followed, confirming the attribution, tracing the manuscript traditions, reconstructing the history of the text's circulation, and Marguerite Porete stepped out of the anonymity that had hidden her for 600 years and took her place again as the author of her own work. It was not a resurrection. She was still dead, still long dead, still reduced to ash and bone, and less than bone in a grave that no one can locate. But her name was alive again, attached once more to the words she'd written, connected once more to the life she had lived and the death she had died. The silence was broken at last, 6 centuries late, but not too late, because there is no too late for the truth, not really, not when someone cares enough to find it, and the book remains. You can read it today, in translation, in editions that bear her name on the cover. You can encounter the same words that moved the readers who never knew they were reading a condemned woman's testament. You can follow the soul's journey through the 7 stages of annihilation, from the soul that still clings to external practices to the soul that has become nothing, has become love, has become so free that it no longer has a self that could be enslaved. You can read it knowing what it cost her, knowing where it led her, knowing that the theology of freedom and dissolution was not an abstraction, but a description of how she chose to live and die. The Inquisition burned her body and her books, and the books came back. The world forgot her name, and the name came back. The silence she kept in her prison cell, those 18 months of refusal, outlasted the centuries of forgetting. Because silence, it turns out, can be a form of speech, and absence can be a form of presence, and a woman who dissolves herself into God may find that she cannot be destroyed, not completely, not in the ways that matter most. She is still here, in every copy of the book that survived, in every reader who encounters her words and feels something shift in the quiet places of their soul. She's still here, speaking the unspeakable, naming what cannot be named, burning without being consumed. The fire that consumed her body burned for perhaps an hour. The fire she started has never gone out. But to understand what made her words so dangerous, what made the authorities decide that this woman and her book could not be permitted to exist, we have to look more closely at what she actually wrote. We have to enter the strange architecture of the mirror of simple souls and follow its logic to the place where the church could not follow, the place where the soul becomes something that no longer needs the church at all. The book is not a treatise. It does not proceed by argument in the scholastic manner, building syllogisms and refuting objections. It is a dialogue, a conversation between allegorical figures, love, reason, and the soul, with occasional interruptions from other personifications, from courtesy and faith and truth. It unfolds like a drama played out on an interior stage, and the drama is the soul's gradual transformation from something that works and strives and follows rules into something that no longer needs to work, no longer needs to strive, no longer needs rules because it has become the thing the rules were pointing toward. Marguerite calls this transformation annihilation. The soul that has completed the journey she describes has been annihilated, not destroyed, but reduced to nothing in itself so that it can become everything in God. This is the central paradox of her mysticism, the knot that the Inquisition could not untie and would not tolerate. The annihilated soul has lost its own will. It no longer wants anything for itself. It no longer chooses virtue over vice, because it has moved beyond the realm where such choices have meaning. It does not avoid sin because it fears punishment or seeks reward. It does not perform good works because the church commands them. It simply is what it is, which is love, which is God, which is nothing and everything at once. To understand how radical this was, how threatening it appeared to the men who examined her, you have to understand what the church offered and what it demanded in return. The medieval church was not merely a spiritual authority. It was the gateway, the only gateway, between the human soul and divine grace. The sacraments, baptism, confession, communion, marriage, ordination, last rites, were the channels through which God's saving power flowed into human life. Without them, salvation was impossible. Without the priests who administered them, the sacraments did not exist. The entire structure of medieval Christianity rested on this arrangement, on the absolute necessity of the institutional church as mediator between the human and the divine. And Marguerite said that for the annihilated soul, this was no longer true. She did not say the sacraments were false. She did not say the church was corrupt, though many of her contemporaries were saying exactly that. She said something stranger and, in its way, more devastating. She said that the soul which had achieved union with God through love had moved beyond the stage where sacraments and virtues and works were necessary. Not because they were wrong, but because they were training wheels, and the annihilated soul had learned to ride without them. The soul in this state, she wrote, gives to nature all that nature demands without remorse of conscience. It takes leave of the virtues and no longer performs works for them. The virtues are good servants, she said, but the free soul has been released from their service. Imagine how this sounded to the theologians who interrogated her. Imagine the bishop's face as he read those words. The virtues were not merely recommendations in medieval Christian thought. They were the substance of the moral life, the framework within which salvation was worked out with fear and trembling. To say that a soul could move beyond virtue, could give to nature what nature demands without remorse, this sounded like permission. It sounded like antinomianism, the heresy that says the saved are not bound by moral law. It sounded like exactly the kind of spiritual elitism that had infected the free spirit movements that troubled the church throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. The free spirit heresy, as the church understood it, was the belief that perfect souls had achieved such union with God that they could do anything without sin. They could fornicate, steal, lie, because they had transcended the moral categories that applied to ordinary believers. Whether any actual movement ever held these beliefs in the crude form the church described is a question historians still debate, but the fear of it was real, and Marguerite's language seemed to confirm the worst suspicions. A soul that no longer serves the virtues, that gives to nature what it demands, that takes leave of the church's mediating role. This was exactly the free spirit doctrine, or close enough that the difference did not matter to frightened inquisitors. But Marguerite meant something different. She meant something that the categories available to her judges could not quite contain. The annihilated soul in her theology does not do evil because it cannot do evil. It has been so completely emptied of its own will that only God's will remains. And God's will, by definition, is good. The soul that has become nothing cannot sin because there is no one left to sin. There is no self that could choose wrongly, no private desire that could conflict with divine love. The giving to nature what nature demands is not license. It is the natural functioning of a body whose soul has been dissolved into God. The body eats when it needs to eat, sleeps when it needs to sleep, performs its ordinary functions without the tortured self-scrutiny that marks the earlier stages of spiritual development. This is not moral indifference. It is the end of moral struggle, the peace that passes understanding, the state in which doing good is no longer effort but simply being. Whether this is coherent, whether it makes philosophical sense, whether it could survive rigorous theological examination, these are questions that scholars continue to ask. What matters for our story is that Marguerite believed it, wrote it down, and refused to take it back. What matters is that she trusted her readers to understand, and the Inquisition did not. The book proceeds through 7 stages of the soul's transformation, and each stage takes the soul further from the world of ordinary Christian practice. In the first stages, the soul is still recognizable as the struggling believer familiar from devotional literature, obeying the commandments, following the virtues, performing the works of mercy, striving toward God through the approved methods. The soul at this level is doing everything the church asks. It is being good in the way the church understands goodness. But Marguerite treats this as a beginning, not an end. The soul that remains at this level, she writes, is still enslaved. Enslaved to its own efforts, enslaved to the fear of doing wrong, enslaved to the hope of reward. It has not yet learned the hardest lesson, which is that all this striving is itself a barrier. The soul that works to become virtuous has not yet understood that God cannot be earned, cannot be won through effort, cannot be reached by any path that begins with the self and its desires, even its desire for holiness. This is where the mirror begins to enter dangerous territory, because the next stages involve a gradual letting go of everything the church teaches a believer to hold on to. The soul releases its attachment to spiritual consolations, the good feelings that come from prayer and devotion. It releases its attachment to the virtues themselves, recognizing that even the desire to be virtuous is a form of self-will. It releases its attachment to its own understanding of God, recognizing that any concept of the divine is smaller than the reality it attempts to grasp. Step by step, the soul empties itself of everything it thought it knew, everything it thought it needed, until there is nothing left but naked love. Love without object or aim or hope of return. The fifth stage is the one that matters most for understanding what happened to Marguerite. In this stage, the soul sees itself as it truly is, which is to say, as nothing. It sees that it never had any being of its own, that everything it possessed was given by God and belongs to God, that the self it thought it was has always been an illusion sustained by pride. This sight, Marguerite writes, annihilates the soul. Not metaphorically, not partially, but completely. The soul that truly sees its own nothingness cannot go on existing as a separate entity. It falls back into the divine abyss from which it came, loses its name, loses its identity, becomes indistinguishable from the God in whom it has drowned. And the soul in this state, she writes, gives leave to the virtues. It no longer performs works for them. It takes no thought for its salvation, because the question of salvation only arises for a self that might be saved or damned, and there is no longer any such self. The annihilated soul does not try to be good. It does not try to avoid evil. It simply is what God is doing through it, moment by moment, without reflection or resistance or remainder. You can feel the trap closing. You can feel how these words, however mystically intended, however carefully grounded in a tradition of apophatic theology that stretches back through Pseudo-Dionysius and Meister Eckhart and the whole cloud of unknowing, you can feel how they would sound to men whose job was to protect the faithful from error. You can feel the questions forming in the inquisitor's mind. If the annihilated soul gives leave to the virtues, does that mean it can sin with impunity? If it no longer serves the church, does that mean the church is unnecessary? If salvation is achieved through this interior transformation alone, what happens to the entire apparatus of priests and sacraments and institutional authority that holds medieval Christianity together? Marguerite was not stupid. She knew how her words would be received. In the mirror itself, she includes a section where reason, personified as a character in the dialogue, raises exactly these objections. Reason is shocked, scandalized, unable to comprehend what love and the soul are describing, and love responds with a kind of gentle contempt for reason's limitations. Reason, she says, serves the Holy Church. Love serves God directly. Reason can only take the soul so far. After that, reason must step aside and let love do its work alone. This was perhaps the most inflammatory passage in the entire book. The Holy Church, staffed by reasonable men who prided themselves on their learning and their logic, was being told that its highest faculty was inadequate to the highest truths. Reason serves the church, but love serves God. The implication is clear. The church, for all its power, for all its claims to mediate between humanity and the divine, operates at a lower level than the soul that has been transformed by pure love. The institution is not wrong, but it is incomplete. It is for beginners. The advanced soul has graduated beyond it. If you want to understand why Marguerite Porete was burned alive, this is the heart of it. Not some minor theological error, not some point of doctrine that might be clarified or corrected. The fundamental architecture of her mysticism relegated the church to a preliminary stage, a schoolroom the soul eventually leaves behind. And the church, which held life and death power over the bodies of the faithful, which claimed to hold the keys to their eternal souls, could not permit this to stand. The trial records that survive are fragmentary, reconstructed from references in other documents and from the single detailed account in the Chronicle of the Continuator of Guillaume de Nangy. But what they reveal is both less and more than we might expect. Less because the theological examination was conducted largely in secret, and we do not have transcripts of the arguments, the back and forth between the inquisitors and their advisors. More because what does survive tells us something crucial about how Marguerite was defeated, or rather, about how she refused to let them defeat her. The Inquisition's method was confession. It sought to bring the accused to an acknowledgement of error, a renunciation of false belief, a return to the fold of orthodoxy. The worst punishment, relaxation to the secular arm, which meant execution, was reserved for those who refused this process, who persisted in heresy after having been given every opportunity to repent. The Church did not want to kill, it wanted submission. The spectacle of the heretic's execution was meant to be rare, meant to demonstrate what happened to those who rejected the mother who only wished to embrace them. Marguerite would not play this game. From the moment she was transferred to the Inquisition's custody in Paris until the day she died, she refused to engage with the process. She would not take the oath that the tribunal required of all witnesses and accused. She would not answer their questions. She would not defend her book, would not explain its passages, would not argue that she had been misunderstood or that her words meant something other than what the theologians took them to mean. She simply stopped speaking. 18 months. We know this from the records, and we know almost nothing else about what those months contained. 18 months in a cell. We do not know the exact conditions, but inquisitorial prisons were not designed for comfort, while the tribunal waited for her to break. They could have forced her. Torture was permitted under certain circumstances, and the Inquisition was not squeamish about using it when persuasion failed. But there is no evidence that Marguerite was tortured. Perhaps they thought she would eventually weaken. Perhaps they hoped that the sheer duration of her confinement would accomplish what threats and arguments could not. Perhaps they did not quite know what to do with a woman who simply refused to participate. Think about what this silence meant. Think about the courage it required. She was not a passive victim, not someone who had been caught up in events beyond her understanding. She knew exactly what she had written and why. She knew what the Inquisition wanted and what refusal would cost. She had already been condemned once before, in Valenciennes, and had continued to circulate her book despite explicit orders to stop. She had, in some sense, been choosing this path for years. And now that the end of the path was in sight, she did not flinch. The silence of Marguerite Porete was itself a statement. It was the annihilated soul in action, the soul that no longer has a self that could be threatened or bribed, the soul that has nothing left to lose because it has already lost everything that could be taken. The Inquisition wanted her to acknowledge their authority, to submit to their judgment, to admit that she had erred and promise never to err again. But an annihilated soul does not acknowledge earthly authority. An annihilated soul has no judgment of its own to submit. An annihilated soul cannot promise anything, because there is no one left to make promises or keep them. This is speculation, of course. We cannot know what passed through her mind during those 18 months in the dark. We cannot know whether she struggled, whether she doubted, whether there were moments when she considered giving them what they wanted just to make it stop. But the record shows only silence. The record shows a woman who chose nothing over something, absence over presence, the darkness of the cell over the light of capitulation. And in the end, the tribunal did what it always did when confronted with someone who would not bend. It broke her, or tried to. On the 1st of June 1310, in the Place de Grève, Marguerite Porete was burned alive along with copies of her book. The chronicle tells us that she showed many signs of devotion and nobility at the end, and that her composure moved many of the spectators to tears. This is a common enough formula in accounts of executions. The good death was a genre, a script that the dying were expected to follow. But something rings true about it nonetheless. A woman who had maintained silence for 18 months, who had faced down the most powerful institution in Christendom without flinching, who had written a book arguing that the annihilated soul cannot be destroyed because there is nothing left to destroy. Such a woman might well have faced the flames with the calm that comes from having already accepted the worst. The fire burned, the smoke rose, the crowd watched, some weeping, some satisfied that heresy had been punished, most simply there because public executions were a form of theatre and everyone came to watch. And when it was over, when the flames had died down and the ashes cooled, the authorities must have believed they had solved the problem. The woman was dead. The book was destroyed. The dangerous ideas she had spread could no longer spread. But ideas, as we have seen, do not die so easily. Even as the flames consumed the copies of the mirror that had been seized, other copies existed. In monasteries and private collections, in the hands of readers who had never known the author's name, the book was already loose in the world. It would go on moving through time, acquiring new languages and new attributions, teaching its lessons about annihilation and freedom to readers who had no idea that the woman who wrote it had been murdered for writing it. The Inquisition had killed Marguerite Porete. It had not killed her book. And in the strange arithmetic of history, the book would prove more durable than the institution that condemned it. The flames that rose over the Place de Grève in 1310 were meant to be an ending. They were meant to close a chapter, seal a judgment, render a verdict from which there was no appeal. But fire, as Marguerite knew, is not only destructive. Fire is also transformative. Fire is what the alchemists used to transmute base metals into gold. Fire is what the mystics used as a metaphor for divine love, the love that burns away the dross of selfhood until only pure spirit remains. The fire that killed Marguerite Porete was meant to destroy her. Instead, it completed her transformation. It turned a woman into a symbol, a book into a legend, a local scandal into a story that would still be told 7 centuries later. And so we come to the strangest chapter of this story, the chapter that takes place after the ending, in the long centuries when Marguerite Porete was supposed to have been forgotten. The fire had done its work. The body was ash. The copies that had been seized were ash. The name that had once been attached to the book was, if not ash, then something close to it. A notation in an inquisitorial record, a footnote in the chronicles of Philip the Fair's reign, a cautionary tale that preachers might invoke when warning their flocks about the dangers of spiritual presumption. For a few years, perhaps a few decades, people in Paris might have remembered the woman who'd been burned in the Place de Grève. They might have remembered her silence, her composure, the strange dignity with which she had faced her death. But memory fades. The living have their own concerns. And soon enough, Marguerite Porete was just another name in a long list of heretics who had been dealt with according to the law. The book, however, was another matter entirely. To understand what happened to the Mirror of Simple Souls after 1310, you have to understand something about how books moved through the medieval world. There was no printing press. That would not come for another 150 years. Every copy of every book was made by hand, letter by letter, word by word, a process that could take months or even years depending on the length of the text. This meant that books were rare and expensive. It also meant that books were personal. Each copy bore the traces of the hands that had made it, the small variations in spelling, the marginal notes, the corrections and emendations that accumulated over time. A book was not a fixed object, but a living thing, changing with each new copy, adapting to new contexts and new readers. And the Mirror of Simple Souls, despite the Inquisition's best efforts, had already begun to spread before Marguerite's arrest. We know this because copies survived. Copies that had been made before 1310, copies that were tucked away in monastic libraries and private collections, copies that the authorities had never known about or had been unable to find. The book was loose in the world, and it was moving. What happened next is one of the most peculiar stories in the history of ideas. The book continued to circulate. It was read and copied and passed from hand to hand. But somewhere along the way, it lost its author. The name Marguerite Porete, dangerous, condemned, associated with heresy and death, was quietly removed from the manuscript tradition. In its place appeared other names, safer names, names that carried the weight of orthodoxy rather than the taint of the stake. In some copies, the book was attributed to a certain Jan van Ruysbroek, a Flemish mystic of impeccable reputation who had died in 1381, decades after Marguerite's execution. In other copies, it was called the work of an anonymous Carthusian, a member of one of the most austere and respected monastic orders in Christendom. In still other copies, no author was given at all. The book simply existed, a voice speaking out of nowhere, teaching its lessons about annihilation and divine love to whoever happened to pick it up. This anonymity was not accidental. Somewhere, somehow, someone had made a decision. Perhaps it was a sympathetic reader who wanted to protect the book from further persecution. Perhaps it was a scribe who knew the real author's identity, but understood that attaching her name to the text would doom it to destruction. Perhaps it was simply the gradual erosion of memory, the way that names fall away from texts over time like leaves falling from a tree. We do not know who made this choice, or when, or why. We know only that it was made, and that it worked. The Mirror of Simple Souls survived. It more than survived, it flourished. Over the next 2 centuries it was translated from Old French into Latin, and from Latin into Middle English, and from Middle English into Italian. It was read by monks and nuns, by anchorites in their cells, by lay people seeking spiritual guidance. It influenced other writers, other mystics, other seekers after the God who could be found only in the darkness beyond all names and forms. The book that had been condemned as heretical became paradoxically a respected spiritual classic. It was copied in monasteries where the rule of Saint Benedict was followed with scrupulous care. It was read aloud in refectories where the brothers and sisters gathered for their silent meals. It was quoted by theologians who had no idea that they were citing the words of a woman who had been burned alive for writing them. Think about this for a moment. Think about what it means. A woman writes a book. The book is condemned as heresy. The woman is burned alive, and copies of the book are thrown into the same fire that consumes her body. And yet the book lives on. Not only does it live on, but it enters the mainstream of Christian spirituality. It is read and admired and copied by the very institutions that had destroyed its author. The Inquisition had killed Marguerite Porete. The Church had absorbed her book. There is something almost comic about this, something that belongs to a dark and bitter comedy about the limits of power. The authorities had the woman killed because her ideas were dangerous. They had her book burned because it spread those dangerous ideas, and then, without realizing it, they spent the next several centuries reading her ideas, copying her ideas, being shaped and influenced by her ideas. The heretic had infiltrated the fortress. The dead woman was speaking from inside the walls. The English translation is particularly significant because it gives us a glimpse of how the mirror was read in a world that had forgotten its origins. The Middle English version was made sometime in the late 14th or early 15th century, probably in the circle of mystical writers that included such figures as the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing and Walter Hilton, who wrote The Scale of Perfection. These were serious people, orthodox in their beliefs, deeply committed to the spiritual life. They would not have touched a book they knew to be heretical, and yet they embraced the Mirror of Simple Souls. They read it, copied it, recommended it to others. The Cloud of Unknowing, one of the great classics of English mysticism, shows clear signs of Marguerite's influence. The emphasis on unknowing, on letting go, on moving beyond all concepts and images into the darkness where God dwells. Walter Hilton, a careful and cautious thinker who would never have knowingly promoted heresy, speaks in terms that echo Marguerite's language about the annihilation of the will. None of them knew. None of them had any idea that the book they were drawing from had been written by a woman condemned and killed by the Inquisition. The disguise had worked. The mask had held. Marguerite Porete had become invisible, and in her invisibility she had become invincible. But there is something melancholy about this triumph too. There is something that feels like a second death, a second burning, because the price of the book's survival was the erasure of the woman who wrote it. For 600 years, from 1310 until 1946, Marguerite Porete was forgotten. Her name disappeared from history. Her story was buried under layers of misattribution and anonymity. The book lived, but the author was lost. The voice continued to speak, but no one remembered whose voice it was. Imagine, if you can, what it would have been like to be one of those 15th century English readers holding a copy of the Mirror in your hands, reading those extraordinary passages about the soul that has become nothing and therefore become everything. You would have felt the power of the writing. You would have sensed the depth of the spiritual experience behind it. You might have wondered about the author, this mysterious figure whose name was given as a Flemish mystic, or a Carthusian monk, or no one at all. But you would never have guessed the truth. You would never have imagined a woman standing in a public square in Paris, flames rising around her, copies of this very book burning in the same fire. That story was gone. That truth was buried. The price of immortality, it seems, is anonymity. The price of the book's survival was the author's disappearance. And yet, and this is the final twist, the final irony in a story full of ironies, the truth came back. Not in Marguerite's lifetime, of course. Not in the century after her death, or the century after that, but eventually, inevitably, the truth found its way to the surface. Because that is what truth does. That is the strange property of things that are true. They resist burial, they resist forgetting, They work their way back up through the accumulated weight of years and centuries until someone somewhere stumbles across them and recognizes them for what they are. The rediscovery happened in stages, as such things usually do. In 1867, a German scholar named Franz Pfeiffer published a Latin text that he believed was connected to the Mirror of Simple Souls. He did not know who had written it. He did not know that it was a translation of a French original. But he sensed that it was important, and he made it available to other scholars who might be able to unravel its mysteries. Then, in 1911, an Italian scholar named Guarnieri began studying the various versions of the mirror that were scattered through libraries across Europe. She noticed something peculiar. The different versions, the Latin, the Middle English, the Italian, all seemed to derive from a common source, a lost original that had been written in Old French. And as she dug deeper, as she compared manuscripts and traced textual variants, she began to suspect that the commonly accepted attributions were wrong. This was not the work of Jan van Roosebrugge. This was not the work of an anonymous Carthusian. This was something else entirely. The breakthrough came in 1946. Romana Guarnieri, working in the Vatican Library, found a 15th century manuscript that contained a Latin translation of the Mirror, and in the margins of that manuscript, in a hand different from the main scribe's, someone had written a note. The note identified the author of the text. It gave her name as Marguerite Porete, a Beguine from Hainaut, who had been burned as a heretic in Paris in 1310. 636 years after her death, Marguerite Porete was found. Her book was finally returned to her. The voice that had been speaking all those centuries was finally given a face, a name, a story. The woman who'd been erased from history was written back into it. Think about what Guarnieri must have felt in that moment, reading that marginal note in a manuscript that had been sitting in the Vatican Library for 500 years. Think about the weight of that discovery, not just the scholarly significance, though that was considerable, but the human significance. A woman had been killed for writing a book. Her enemies had done everything in their power to destroy her and her work. They had burned her body and burned her book and struck her name from the record. And yet here it was, in faded ink on a 500-year-old page, the proof that they had failed. The proof that Marguerite Porete, Beguine, mystic, heretic, author, had been here, had written these words, had meant something. The years after 1946 brought a slow but steady process of rehabilitation. Scholars began to study the Mirror of Simple Souls with new eyes, now that they knew who had written it and what had happened to her. They began to see it not just as a devotional text, but as a work of philosophy and theology, a serious intellectual contribution to the debates about mysticism and the nature of the divine that had occupied the best minds of the medieval world. They began to understand Marguerite not as a wild-eyed fanatic or a dangerous heretic, but as a sophisticated thinker who had grappled with some of the deepest questions human beings can ask. What is the relationship between the soul and God? What happens when we let go of everything we think we know, everything we think we are? Is there a place beyond virtue and vice, beyond good and evil, beyond the endless striving that constitutes ordinary human life? And if there is, what does it look like? What does it feel like? How do we get there? The Inquisition had answered these questions with fire. History has answered them differently. Today, the Mirror of Simple Souls is available in modern editions and translations. It is taught in universities. It is read by scholars of mysticism and feminist theologians, and anyone interested in the long, strange history of human beings trying to find their way to God. Marguerite Porete has been, if not rehabilitated by the church that killed her, at least recognized as a significant figure in the history of Christian spirituality. Her book is no longer banned. Her ideas are no longer heresy. The woman who was turned to ash has become, in some small way, immortal. And there is something fitting about this, something that Marguerite herself might have appreciated. Because what is annihilation, really? What is the death of the self that she wrote about with such passion and such precision? It is not destruction. It is not the end. It is transformation. It is the burning away of everything that is not essential, everything that is not true, until only the pure essence remains. The fire that killed Marguerite Porete's body did not kill her soul. She would have said that there was no soul left to kill, that the soul had already returned to its source in God. and the fire that was meant to destroy her book did not destroy her book. It only began the process by which the book would be purified, refined, separated from the dross of its historical moment, and transmitted across the centuries as something timeless and universal. The alchemists believed that fire was the great transformer, the agent that turned base metals into gold. The mystics believed that divine love was a fire that burned away the self until only God remained. Marguerite Porete wrote about this fire. She taught that the soul must be willing to be annihilated, to be reduced to nothing, to pass through the flames of divine love until there is nothing left but the love itself. And then she herself was given to the flames. She became, in her death, the embodiment of her own teaching. She was annihilated. She was transformed. She passed through the fire and emerged on the other side of centuries as something new. The book that went into the flames in 1310 was a dangerous thing, a forbidden thing, a text that threatened the established order and the authority of the Church. The book that emerged from the long anonymity of the manuscript tradition was something else entirely, a classic of Christian spirituality, a document of the human search for God, a testament to the courage and vision of a woman who refused to be silenced even when silence was the only thing that could save her life. And perhaps this is the final lesson of Marguerite Porete's story. Perhaps this is what her life and death and strange afterlife have to teach us. The powers of this world, the institutions, the authorities, the men with their commissions and their legal procedures and their fires, they can destroy bodies, they can burn books, they can strike names from the record and condemn ideas as heresy. But they cannot destroy what is true. They cannot silence what needs to be said. They can push the truth underground, bury it under centuries of forgetting, disguise it under false names and false attributions. But eventually, inevitably, the truth comes back. It finds its way to the surface. It speaks again in its own voice. Marguerite Porete knew this. She must have known it, in some deep part of herself, when she chose silence over recantation, when she chose the flames over the compromise that would have saved her life. She must have known that the Inquisition could destroy her, but it could not destroy what she had written. She must have trusted that the words would find their way, that the truth would endure, that somewhere, someday, someone would read the mirror of simple souls and understand what she had understood and see what she had seen. And they did. They do. Even now. In university libraries and monastery archives, in the quiet studies of scholars and the private reading rooms of seekers, people still open the mirror of simple souls. They still encounter Marguerite's voice, that strange, luminous, demanding voice, speaking across 700 years as if no time had passed at all. They still wrestle with her ideas, still feel the vertiginous pull of her vision, still find themselves unsettled and moved and transformed by words that were supposed to have been erased from the world. This is the strangest part of Marguerite Porete's story. Not the tragedy of her death. Tragic deaths are common enough in history, and the 14th century was full of them. Not the cruelty of the Inquisition. Institutional cruelty is one of the oldest stories we know. Not even the long centuries of anonymity, when her book circulated under names that were not hers. The strangest part is this: she won. Not in any way that would have comforted her in the darkness of her prison cell, not in any way that would have spared her the flames, but in the longest view, the view that stretches across centuries and sees human lives as moments in a much vaster story, Marguerite Porete achieved exactly what she set out to achieve. She wrote a book that would teach people how to love God. She wanted that book to survive. She wanted it to be read. She wanted the truth she had discovered to be passed on, shared, transmitted from soul to soul across the generations. And that is exactly what happened. The men who condemned her are forgotten. William of Paris. Who remembers him? He was Inquisitor of France, confessor to the king, one of the most powerful churchmen of his age. Today he is a footnote in the story of someone he tried to destroy. The theologians who declared her book heretical, their names appear in the trial records and nowhere else. The bishops who sat in judgment, the guards who led her to the Place de Grève, the executioner who lit the fire, they are less than dust. But Marguerite Porete is still here. Her words are still being read. Her ideas are still being debated, studied, prayed over. The woman who was supposed to be annihilated has proven to be, in the most literal sense, indelible. And this is fitting, because indelibility was part of her teaching. The soul that has achieved union with God, she wrote, can never be separated from God again. It has become something that cannot be undone. It has passed beyond the reach of time and change and destruction. It has become, in a sense, eternal. Marguerite would not have claimed this eternity for herself. She would not have wanted fame or remembrance or the veneration of later generations. Her whole teaching was about the annihilation of the self, the disappearance of the I that wants and claims and grasps. To desire one's own immortality, one's own legacy, one's own place in history. This would have been, for her, the opposite of spiritual progress. It would have been attachment. It would have been the will asserting itself when the will should have fallen silent. But there is a deeper level to her teaching, and perhaps this is where we can find her at peace with what has happened. The annihilated soul, she wrote, does not act for itself. It does not will anything for itself, but through it, God acts. Through it, divine love moves in the world. The soul becomes an instrument, a vessel, a transparency through which something larger flows. And if God chose to preserve the mirror of simple souls, if divine providence arranged for manuscripts to be copied and hidden and misattributed and eventually recovered, who was Marguerite Porete to have an opinion about that? The soul that has given up its will has given up its preferences about outcomes. What happens, happens. What survives, survives. What is meant to be spoken is spoken, and what is meant to be heard is heard. Perhaps this is the only way to make sense of her silence, not as stubbornness, not as pride, not as a death wish or a calculated martyrdom, but as the deepest possible expression of what she believed. She had said what she had to say. The book existed. The words were in the world. What happened next was not up to her. She had given up the will that would have strategized, that would have calculated how to survive, that would have said the words the Inquisition wanted to hear in order to save her body and live to write another day. That will was dead. What remained was only the silence, and the waiting, and then the fire. We will never know what she thought in those last moments. We will never know if she was afraid, or peaceful, or both at once. We will never know if she looked at the crowd gathered to watch her die, and felt anything at all, compassion, sorrow, indifference. The strange detachment of someone already more absent than present. We know only that she did not recant, did not cry out, did not give the Inquisition the satisfaction of her surrender. She went to the flames as she had lived her last 18 months, in silence. And the silence speaks across the centuries, louder than any word she might have said. There is a tradition in Christian mysticism of what is called apophatic theology, the theology of negation, the attempt to speak about God by saying what God is not. God is not this, not that, not anything we can name or imagine or understand. Every statement about God is ultimately inadequate, and so the mystic turns to silence, to the admission that the divine exceeds all our categories and concepts and words. Marguerite Porete practiced this kind of theology in her writing, circling around the mystery at the centre of her experience, using paradox and poetry and the voice of Lady Love to gesture toward what could not be directly said. And then, at the end, she practiced it in her life. She became the silence. She enacted the unknowing. She passed beyond the reach of the Inquisition's questions into a realm where questions no longer had any meaning. The crowd that watched her burn saw a heretic receiving her just punishment. The Inquisition saw the triumph of orthodoxy over error. The Church saw a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to write dangerous books or teach dangerous ideas. But what was actually happening, what was really going on in those flames, was invisible to all of them. A soul that believed itself already annihilated was completing its annihilation. A woman who had taught that divine love was a consuming fire was being consumed. A mystic who had written that the soul must pass through the flames to reach its final freedom was passing through. We cannot know if she was right. We cannot know if anything she believed was true. The existence of God, the nature of the soul, the possibility of union with the divine, these are questions that have no answers available to historical research or scholarly inquiry. They are questions of faith, and faith by definition exceeds what can be proven or demonstrated. What we can say is that Marguerite Porete believed, with total conviction, that what she had experienced was real, and that what she had written was true. She believed it enough to die for it. She believed it enough to be silent for 18 months while the Inquisition waited for her to break. She believed it enough to stand in the flames without recanting a single word. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps, in the end, the content of her belief matters less than the quality of her believing. She lived what she taught. She died what she taught. She was willing to be annihilated, and she was annihilated. Whether her vision of God and the soul was accurate in some ultimate metaphysical sense, that is a question we cannot answer. But whether she was sincere, whether she was brave, whether she was one of those rare human beings who are willing to follow the truth as they see it all the way to the end, that is a question we can answer, and the answer is yes. 7 centuries later, we live in a different world. The Inquisition no longer burns heretics. The Church no longer claims the authority it once possessed. The ideas that Marguerite Porete died for, the primacy of inner experience, the unmediated relationship between the individual and God, the inadequacy of institutional structures to contain the spiritual life, these ideas have become, in various forms, mainstream. We live in her victory, even if we do not know her name, but her name is being recovered now, her authorship is being restored. The long centuries of anonymity are ending, and Marguerite Porete is stepping forward again, claiming what was always hers. The book that circulated as the work of unknown Carthusians, as the teaching of Ruysbroek, as the mysticism of anonymous monks. That book now bears its proper attribution. The woman who was erased is being unerased. The silence that was imposed upon her is being filled, at last, with the sound of her own voice. And her voice is strange. It is still strange, even now. It does not fit comfortably into any of our categories. She was a Christian mystic, but her Christianity was so radical that the Church condemned it. She was a woman who claimed spiritual authority in an age when women were supposed to be silent and obedient. She was a writer who created one of the most original and demanding works of medieval literature in the vernacular French of the common people, not the Latin of the learned. She was a Beguine, neither nun nor laywoman, occupying a space between categories that made her suspect from the beginning. Everything about her was liminal, transgressive, hard to place, and perhaps that is why she was so dangerous. She could not be contained. She exceeded the boxes that were supposed to hold her. The Mirror of Simple Souls is still difficult to read. The language is sometimes obscure, the argument hard to follow, the meaning elusive. Scholars have spent decades trying to parse exactly what she meant, trying to reconstruct her theological system, trying to understand how her ideas relate to the broader tradition of Christian mysticism. They have not reached consensus. They probably never will. Marguerite Porete resists interpretation. She slips away just when you think you have grasped her. This is not a failure of her writing, but an expression of its deepest insight. That the ultimate truths cannot be captured in concepts, cannot be fixed in formulas, cannot be possessed and held and owned. The soul that tries to grasp God loses God. The reader who tries to master the mirror of simple souls finds the mirror reflecting back their own incomprehension. But you do not have to understand Marguerite Porete to be moved by her. You do not have to agree with her theology to feel the force of her vision. You do not have to be a Christian, or a mystic, or a believer in God at all to recognize that something real happened here. That a woman who lived 700 years ago touched something true about the human condition and found a way to express it that still resonates today. The longing for transcendence, the desire to escape the narrow confines of the self, the intuition that there is something more than the visible world of forms and institutions and social roles. These are not medieval concerns. They are human concerns. They are concerns that find expression in every culture and every age, in religion and in art and in philosophy and in the wordless reaching of the heart towards something it cannot name. Marguerite Porete named it. She called it divine love, and she described its action on the soul with a precision and a passion that have rarely been matched. She described what it feels like to be seized by something larger than yourself, to be transformed from within, to become, gradually and then all at once, something other than what you were. She described the terror of that transformation and its joy. She described the resistance of the will and the final surrender of the will. She described what lies on the other side of surrender, the strange peace, the paradoxical freedom, the discovery that what you thought you were losing was never really yours to begin with. And then she went silent. And then she died. And then, for 600 years, her name disappeared from her own book, and the book circulated as if she had never existed, as if the words had somehow written themselves, as if the vision had appeared from nowhere, authored by no one. And then, in the early 20th century, a scholar noticed a reference in an old chronicle. compared some manuscripts, made a connection, and Marguerite Porete began to return. She is still returning. Every year, new scholarship appears, new translations are made, new readers encounter her for the first time and find themselves unsettled and moved and changed. The process that began with Romano Guarnieri's discovery in 1946 is still unfolding. We're still in the early stages of understanding who Marguerite Porete was and what she achieved. We're still learning how to read her, and perhaps we will never finish. Perhaps she will always be a step ahead of us, always disappearing around the corner just as we think we have caught up, always slipping away into the silence at the heart of her teaching. The soul that has achieved annihilation cannot be pinned down. It has no fixed location. It is everywhere and nowhere. It has become indistinguishable from the love that moves the sun and the other stars. This is, finally, what her story teaches us. Not a doctrine, not a system, not a set of propositions to be believed or rejected, but something simpler and more profound. It teaches us that the human spirit is resilient beyond what we can imagine. It teaches us that truth has a tendency to survive, even when powerful forces are arrayed against it. It teaches us that there are forms of courage that have nothing to do with armies, or battles, or physical strength. The courage to think what no one else is thinking, to say what no one else is saying, to stand alone against the weight of an entire civilization and refuse to bend. Marguerite Porete had that courage. She had it in the writing of her book, when she dared to describe an experience that exceeded the boundaries of orthodoxy. She had it in the distribution of her book, when she continued to circulate the text even after it had been condemned and burned. She had it in her trial, when she refused to swear the oath that would have begun her cooperation with the Inquisition. And she had it at the end, when she stood in the flames and did not cry out, did not beg for mercy, did not purchase a few more years of life with a lie. What do we owe such courage? What do we owe the woman who died 7 centuries ago for ideas we may not even understand, let alone share? Perhaps only this: to remember her, to speak her name, to read her words and let them do their strange work on us, whatever that work might be. To acknowledge that she existed, that she wrote, that she thought, that she loved, that she suffered, that she died, to refuse to let her be erased again. The fire on the Place de Grève burned for hours. When it finally died down, there was nothing left. No body to be buried, no relic to be venerated, no physical trace of the woman who had been. The ashes were swept away. The crowd dispersed. The Inquisition went on to other cases, other heretics, other fires. Paris continued its business. The world kept turning. But somewhere, in a monastery, scriptorium, or a Beguine's private collection, or a scholar's hidden library, a copy of the Mirror of Simple Souls lay waiting. The words that were supposed to have died with their author were still there, preserved on vellum, patient, silent, ready to speak again whenever someone opened the book and began to read. They are ready still. They have been waiting for you. And now, 700 years after the flames, here is what remains. Not ashes, not silence, not the victory of the Inquisition over a stubborn woman. But a book, and a name, and a voice that speaks across the centuries, saying what it always said, teaching what it always taught. The soul must be willing to be annihilated. The soul must pass through the fire. The soul must give up everything, even itself, even its longing to give things up. And when there is nothing left, when the fire has done its work, when the will is dead and the self is emptied and the silence is complete, then, and only then, does the soul discover what it always was: love, only love. Love without beginning or end, without cause or condition, without object or subject. Love that moves through the world like fire, transforming everything it touches, destroying nothing that is real. Marguerite Porete discovered this love. She wrote about it the best she could. She died for it, or rather, she died into it, completing in her body what she had already completed in her soul, and her words remain, patient, waiting, still burning, with a fire that does not consume. Somewhere tonight, someone will open a copy of the Mirror of Simple Souls. They will encounter her voice for the first time. They will feel something stir in them, some recognition, some longing, some answering fire, and the work will continue. The transmission will go on. The woman they tried to erase will speak again, in her own words, under her own name, to another soul ready to hear. This is her immortality. This is her victory. This is what remained. when the flames died down and the ashes blew away. Only the words, only the love, only the silence that speaks.